Hi, everybody. This week we are going to be covering the process called socialization and the developing of the self. So, this is kind of the presentation or the portion of our class where we explore this intersection between sociology, which is the scientific study of patterns of human behavior and human interactions, and psychology, which is kind of the scientific study of the human mind and the individual self. So obviously, as sociologists, we're interested in humans and how we become human beings, and a lot of that has to do with this process called socialization. So the big idea here is that as human beings, none of us are born knowing anything. None of us are born having preferences based off of what is expected to be normal for our gender or for our socioeconomic status, for the region that we live in, for our cultures that we're a part of. We're not born, for example, knowing if we're boys that we should like football or if we're girls that we should like ballet. Those are behaviors that we learn, and we learn them through this process called socialization. And as we'll unpack in this particular presentation, the series of video lectures this week, as we get socialized, as young children especially, and young adults in our lives, we really start to develop a sense of who we are as individuals, and that helps us establish our identities that we have as an individual. It helps us understand the roles that we feel we are expected to fulfill in our society. It helps us develop things like our statuses in society. And all of those things, our roles, our statuses, our identities, give us very firm sets of values and beliefs that help us shape and make sense of who we are as individuals. But it's important to note from a sociological perspective that none of that is intrinsic behavior, meaning we're not naturally born with any sense of understanding of who we are as humans, as social beings. Virtually every aspect of who we are as an individual is something that we have learned, and we learn this through socialization, which, as we'll talk about, is very much a symbolic interactionist term. It's how we interact with other human beings, how knowledge, values, and beliefs are transmitted through social interactions, and how we internalize those knowledge, values, and beliefs to develop a sense of who we are as an individual in the society that we're a part of. So the objectives for this series of video lectures on socialization, the development of self, is first to understand this process of socialization. How is it that we learn who we are in terms of all of the different identities or statuses that we occupy as an individual, and also to compare and contrast a few different theories of self-development. As we'll talk about here, sociologists kind of theorize or explain how we develop a sense of self in different ways, kind of like theories, right? Last week we talked about the big three theories: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, all of which explain human behavior in different ways. Well, similarly, there are different theories on self-development that are commonly discussed in sociology, and we're going to take a look at two of the main theories of self-development in this series of video lectures this week. So to begin, I'd like to ask you a question to get you kind of thinking in this mindset of self-development from a sociological perspective. I'd like you to consider how you developed your tastes and your preferences for a number of different things. So consider, for example, how did you develop your taste or your preferences for foods, right? Think of foods that you really like or foods that you dislike. And then ask yourself, how did you come to like or dislike those foods? And then you can ask yourself the same thing for music, right? What are your preferences for music? Certain types of music you really like or dislike, clothing, and even sexual partners. Okay, so take a few minutes. If you'd like to pause this video and even write some of this down or journal some of this might be interesting content to discuss in your weekly discussion post this week. Think about this. How did you develop your taste and preferences for these things? And then ask yourself, do you think you're the way you are because of biology, meaning you were born with these natural proclivities or these preferences for certain things like food, music, sexual partners, etc.? Or do you think you have these preferences because of nurture, meaning that they were socially learned traits? So if you'd like I said, pause the video, take a few minutes and reflect on this, and then when you're ready, go ahead and hit play. So this nature versus nurture debate is always something that's really commonly thrown at us as sociologists. Now, as you might anticipate, in sociology, we're far more interested in the nurture aspect of things than the biological aspect, meaning we're interested in better understanding how the social influences that we have in our life shape how we come to understand who we are, and a lot of that understanding of who we are is guided by our preferences that we have for certain things, right? Whether it's, for example, things like foods. Well, some of you may say, that you love broccoli, and some of you may say you absolutely hate broccoli. Now, how could we explain that? Well, of course, our preferences for foods are in some ways facilitated by biological traits, right? Things like our taste buds. No two humans have the exact same taste buds, right? No two humans have the exact same palate. We're born with different biological preferences for certain foods. Some things affect us differently. Some things taste different to certain people. For example, something like 15% of the population, if they eat cilantro, they taste soap, right? While the other 85% of the population just tastes the herb cilantro. So there's some things that we definitely can't control, right? But also consider how your preferences for certain foods are influenced by social aspects of your life. For example, we live in South Texas, so barbecue culture here is very big. A lot of people down here really love a slab of barbecue ribs, right? And that's a preference that you probably have that people, say, from another country, from another society or another culture, like we'll talk about next week, maybe don't have that same preference for foods, right? Also, Hispanic culture, very big down here. It's very common for people, when I ask people, what's your favorite breakfast food? A lot of people will say tacos. Where I come from up in North Dakota, tacos definitely aren't something we associate with breakfast food. It's a dinner food maybe. But that preference for certain foods is something that is a socially learned trait, right? Now, interestingly, our biological traits and our socially learned traits have a lot more in common than we often realize. For example, consider certain foods that maybe you have a really averse physical reaction to, foods that make you cringe, that disgust you, and then consider what experiences have you had in your social life that may contribute to these physical or seemingly biological adverse reactions that you have to these foods. One good example I always share, when I first started drinking back in my day, the cheap and easy thing to drink, my friends in college and I we'd buy a cheap jug of like vodka, right? Like the $9.99 1.75 liter bottle of vodka. We'd pitch in on that, and we would go to a gas station and we'd buy energy drinks to mix with our vodka. All right. Now, my poison of choice was the Blue Rockstar energy drink. That's what I preferred, so I would get one of those, and we'd pass around our bottle of vodka and pour the vodka in there and drink it before we'd go to a party that night. All right. Now, I can no longer drink Blue Rockstars because when I taste them, all I taste is that cheap, $9.99 rubbing alcohol type vodka, right? So in my mind, my neurotransmitters, which are connected from my taste buds, or to connect my taste buds to my brain, which signals to me whether or not foods taste good in my mind, has been affected by this actual behavior that I engaged in my everyday life, which was an aspect of my sociology, my society that I was a part of. So now whenever I see a Blue Rockstar, if I go into a gas station, I walk by a cooler and I see a Blue Rockstar in there, I literally cringe because it just automatically, I taste rubbing alcohol in my mouth, that cheap, gross vodka that I drank when I was a college student many, many years ago. So we develop these preferences for things like food, obviously for music and clothing, largely as a result of the environments that we're a part of, our socialization. For example, growing up, I really loved country music because everyone in my family listened to it. Everyone in my community listened to it. About 95% of the radio stations that I had access to in my small town in North Dakota played country music. So that's what I grew up listening to, and that's what I had a preference towards. As I got older, again, as I went into college, moved to a bigger city, all of a sudden I started getting exposed to people that had a lot more diversity in terms of their preferences for music. I was exposed to more R&B and jazz and hip hop than I was when I was younger. The radio stations in this larger city were more diverse. I started buying CDs and downloading songs on my iPod Nano that were far more eclectic than what I was exposed to in my younger generation. So my preferences for music and clothing adapted as my social environment adapted. Sexual partners is another contentious debate. Are people born heterosexual or gay or bisexual? Or is that a learned behavior? We're not going to get into that, this biological nature versus nurture argument with sexual partners isn't so much interesting to us as a sociologist as is the question is, why do we care so much about people's sexual partners in the first place? And how do we build society that privileges certain sexualities and disadvantages others? But the big thing I want you to take away from this reflection here is that oftentimes, even things that seem completely innate, completely biological, like our preferences for foods, can be affected by social factors. So the big thing we're considering here is how we as individuals come to develop a sense of who we are as individuals in any given society by recognizing the influence that other people, other agents of socialization, as we'll call them in just a few minutes here, impact how we come to make sense of ourselves in the worlds that we're a part of. So let's talk a little bit more about human development. Children do not naturally develop into adolescence. They do not naturally develop into young adults. Physically, our bodies will continue to grow, but without human interaction, without socialization, a human cannot learn how to communicate, they cannot learn how to interact with others, and therefore they will never be able to develop a sense of self. We need human interaction in order to become fully functioning human beings. Without being taught how to communicate, without being taught how to interact with other people, we would never progress past infancy, right? We would not learn how to communicate with others. We would be severely learning disabled if we did not have human interaction and communication starting from a very, very young age, starting from infancy. For the most part, we as human beings are born as blank canvases. Our environments that we live in and the social interactions that we have with others largely shape the people that we become. So this is really controversial, right? This is one of the hardest things to grasp about sociology, especially in American society, because like I've said from the beginning of this class, we're really taught to think that we as individuals have complete control over our sense of self, over who we are, right? Which to a degree, there's some truth to that, because living in America, we do have a lot of freedom of choice, right? We get to choose what types of foods we eat. We get to choose what types of music we listen to, what types of clothes we wear, the sexual partners that we want to have. However, the environments that we're a part of, the interactions we have with others, shape who we are and who we become. So while we like to think that we're completely individualistic, autonomous, free-willed human beings, sociology says, don't go too far with that, because we need to recognize the power, the significance that interactions that we have with others have over the people that we become. Okay? So while our biology may shape our general temperament and certain tastes that we have for certain things, it's our social environments that largely influence and can often reshape or remold these things. So for example, are there any foods you absolutely hated as a child that you now enjoy as an adult, right? Think about how your taste for certain things like food, music, etc. shift over time. Maybe when you were a kid, the thought of eating sushi totally grossed you out, right? Raw fish, ew, why would you eat that? Disgusting. But as you got older, maybe you got exposed to eating sushi. Maybe you had friends that liked it, or friends that kind of made you feel like eating sushi was really cool or a popular or hip thing to do. So you decided to go out to eat sushi with them one time. And you're like, hey, this isn't too bad. And maybe if you didn't really like it at first, you thought it was going to be a good status marker for you to be someone that likes to eat sushi. So you kept eating it. And the more you ate it, the more you started to kind of like it, right? The same thing as with coffee. Not many young kids really enjoy the taste of coffee. If you're little and you ever asked your mom or dad, hey, can I try your coffee? And they let you sip it. And you're like, oh, this is so bitter and gross. Why would you drink it? And now as college students, I'm sure many of you live off the stuff, right? You need to drink coffee every day to get that caffeine boost and to keep you going, right? So our taste for things shift over time, and oftentimes they shift as a result of these social environments that we're a part of and the social interactions that we have with other human beings.